I turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's later, I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens. Kim's
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing the
My name is Karen Shoemaker, and I have lived in Nebraska all my life so far. I was born and raised in Holt County, I lived in O'Neill, north of Grand Island. And I moved to Lincoln about 22 or 23 years ago. And I'm currently what I sort of bill myself as a writer mom. I stopped teaching at the university a year ago, where I taught creative writing and writing classes and literature classes. And I'm currently taking care of my children and writing. The horizon of the Nebraska plains has the biggest influence. It's sort of driving me to see what's on the other side. And I think that's what I do as a writer, keep trying to figure something out. And so I remember as a child that horizon was so alluring to me. And I find that shows up as a metaphor in my writing also. I belong to a writers group called Prairie Trout, and Marge Sizer, Twyla Hansen, Pam Barger, and Mary Pfeiffer are in this writers group, and they have been incredibly supportive and helpful in the writing and publishing and work. So their influence of the last 7 years has been helpful. As far as how I became a writer, my mom told stories, was always telling stories about what she did on the farm, different things that happened to her. Just everything kind of became a story. So I just sort of grew up listening to my mom tell a story while she was cooking or cleaning or working in the garden. So I would say that hearing stories was the biggest influence on my life. Most often I would have to say it comes from a phrase, that words themselves are my inspiration. Somehow or another a phrase will occur to me, or I will read it, hear it in someone else's writing, and from that something starts building. It's kind of energy that comes up in the form of a story or a poem or an essay. So just the words are the most inspiring thing. The images I see come to me in words. I write a lot about what the experience is of being a young woman or a girl or a mother in this day and age. So common experience. This afternoon I read some stories at a class over at Wesleyan, and all of them, it turned out, were about mortality. And so I realized that yes, I do have some themes that I don't really set out to write about them, but the idea of what we do with our lives when we know it could end at any moment, that we continue to live as if it's not going to end in every moment, and that theme tends to show up in my writing. But I would say if I had one theme, it would be more about relationships, about just relationships between people, and especially between women. The same thing that keeps me writing is that you just have to do it. One of my favorite quotes that help me write is by Isaac Denison, who wrote Out of Africa, "Write a little each day without hope and without despair." And that idea that I continue to write, even when I don't have a story, when I have a story going, or anything, just to sit down and write. Now, sometimes that's just in a journal, sometimes it's a story or a poem, but that idea that you just have to write. If you want to write, you just have to write. And as far as getting published, keep trying. It's hard. I guess become more prolific. I want to just keep writing. I'm happy with this. I'm happy with telling stories. So I hope to just keep writing and growing as a writer, learning the craft more and becoming more skillful as a writer.
Good evening. My name is Susan Herrick, and I would like to welcome you to the Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors in the 121st program of the John H. Ames Reading Series. The Heritage Room is a special collection dedicated to preserving and promoting works by and about Nebraska authors. Currently, we maintain a collection of over 11,000 volumes with more than 3,000 published authors from Nebraska. In an effort to promote these authors, the Heritage Room, along with the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, sponsors the John H. Ames Reading Series to bring the authors and audiences together in a local setting. I would particularly like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because it is through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts that we are able to bring you programs like these. We are truly grateful to them. I welcome and encourage all of you to visit our collection during the regular public service hours so you can experience the many treasures and resources Nebraska authors can provide. Karen Shoemaker received her Ph.D. in creative writing from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, 1997. She taught writing and literature classes at UNL for 8 years and has conducted writing workshops for the select high school students at the Marie Sandos Young Writers Workshop. She participated in the Writers' Right, a writing workshop for Lincoln Public School 8th graders, and on occasion conducts the writing workshop, The Right Stuff. Karen Shoemaker's fiction has been published in the South Dakota Review, Heartlands Today, Fine Lines, Loris, and the Nebraska Review. Forthcoming, she'll have poetry in the Prairie Schooner and West Wind Review. Her nonfiction has been aired on Nebraska Public Radio's Nebraska Nightly and has been published in local newspapers and trade magazines. She is the recipient of the Verlin Award and 2 Marie Sandos Prairie Schooner Prizes for her fiction and a Nebraska Press Association Award for Best Featured Article for her nonfiction. I'm happy to present Karen Shoemaker.
This poem is entitled Daily Grace. It has an epigraph by Michael Seifert. This is a wonderful image of God, no? I think we are neither in the raw cotton or the thread, but in the twirling. It is in the padding of your daughter's feet down the hallway after lights out, in her hand trailing the foot of your bed, in her whisper, "You forgot to give me good dreams." It is in the contraction of the muscles you use to sit up, to rub your hands all over her head, catching curls and snarls in your fingers. You pull out the bad dreams, roll them in a ball, toss them into the trash. It is in the moment when there's room for good dreams only and no bad. In the moment when you whisper, a whirring, whispery sound that becomes only a few real words. Words like friends, words like play, like chocolate, rainbows, and laughter. It is in the kiss from Cupid's lips, the quick turn of her tight body skipping back to her own bed, packed full of good dreams and wild love. It is in your son at the breakfast table, making you read his favorite comics in just the right order. In him saying, "Get it?" after you read each one. It is in you asking him to wait when he begins to leave. It is in his waiting. It is in the whirring, whispery, almost sound that passes between you. It is in the bones of his hands when he gives you the sculpture he made in art class. And you smile because you get it. You get it. It is in the quick kiss in the vicinity of the lips, in the sunlight that shines on his dark brown hair as he runs for the school bus, in your daughter's small hand waving, "Goodbye, goodbye," and it shines. Oh, it shines like the wild love you feel for them. The story I'm going to read tonight is the one that's coming out in the Prairie Schooner sometime soon, no date set. It's entitled Playing Horses. The first time Robin came back for a visit, my mother warned me she might have outgrown me. She might have matured faster than you did, were her exact words. I was helping her hang the wash on the line that stretched across the backyard when she told me this. As always, I was in charge of clothespins. I straddled the little red wagon and scooched along behind her, imagining the wagon a prairie schooner and the wet clothes around me canyon walls. I didn't answer her. I just handed her another clothespin and thought about Robin's visit. In her last letter, she had told me she was going to bring pictures of the horses in the field across from her house. I wake up every morning, and the first thing I do is look out and see them in the field. I always pretend that the Palomino is mine and the big black one is yours, because I know how much you like black horses, she had written. She didn't sound any different than when she had left. Even though my mom said she was probably a whole lot more grown up than I was, I went on planning her visit as if she was still my best friend, just like she was when she had moved away. The neighborhood where Robin and I had been friends was full of kids, but few friends. My family lived in a rundown house with a big yard that wrapped around the last house on the block, like the cookie that's left after the bite. On one side we looked toward a trailer court, on the other toward rentals in varying degrees of disrepair. Both of those views were superior to what adjoined us on the north. On that side, across a narrow alley, was our little town's little slum. 9 or 10 houses on one block that we all called, for reasons that still escape me, Goat Alley. We were better than anybody on that street, and on the other streets, most people moved in and out so fast we hardly had time to get to know them. Only 3 families stayed in our neighborhood for any length of time, and we had something like 16 or 17 kids between us. The neighborhood felt full, and we all felt we belonged to something bigger than ourselves. We weren't much. We didn't love each other intensely or even like each other all that much all the time. But we were familiar to one another, and that seemed to count for something. When the chill of winter blew into town, we knew we could count on one another to show up next summer for the next baseball season. We could trust one another to remember who had hit a home run and who had to climb over Old Man Osborne's fence to retrieve the lucky ball. On the other hand, the rental people came and went in no discernible pattern, and you couldn't be sure they would be there next week, much less next season, so what was the point of them? You might play hide and seek with them some evening, or let them in on neighborhood games, just to even up sides when necessary. But if push came to shove, it was us against them. We were a team, and no rental kid was going to get in on that solid front. We even made up a rule, just so they would know their place. We said, loudly and often, that you couldn't be a real neighbor until you had lived in your house for 5 years. Okay, so we weren't much, and we knew it. There's an ugliness that comes with that kind of knowing. It wasn't that we had a leader we followed into trouble. It was that we didn't, and so sometimes we followed a base instinct to be better than something. If it hadn't been rental kids, it would have been something else. Each other, maybe. Probably. All our parents worked during the day. In the early days of the neighborhood, there may have been some kind of daycare arrangements, but by the time I came along, the authority figure in most households was an older brother or sister. If we were alive at the end of the day, they had lived up to their end of the bargain. Once, on one of those long, unsupervised days, my brother and one of the neighbor boys decided they didn't want us girls playing in the same yard they were in. They told us, "Get out or die." Mary and Lucy yelled a few names at them, used words they shouldn't have even known, but they did it over their shoulders on their way to another yard. I don't know if I was being stupid that day, or rebellious, or what, but I said, no, I wasn't going anywhere. We were there first. Anyway, it's my yard and you can't make me leave, I said. I sat down on the grass to prove my point. The boys just looked at each other and laughed. They didn't say anything to each other. They just knew what to do. My brother grabbed one ankle, and the neighbor boy grabbed the other. "You're going to wish you left when you had the chance," one of them said. Then they took off running. I wasn't much more than 9 at the time, and my little girl body wasn't much weight for 2 teenage boys. They ran through the garden where last year's corn stalks stuck up from the ground like spikes. They didn't slow down until they got to the gravel driveway, and then only because they were laughing so hard they couldn't run anymore. I screamed the whole time, and that made it funnier. When I rolled over to stand up, the sight of my bloody back scared them into silence. "Oh no, we're dead," one of them finally said. Then the neighbor boy took off as if there were some place to hide in this neighborhood. My brother knew there was nowhere to go, and at first he just stood there staring at me saying, "Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no." I know it was fear of punishment in store for him that made him help me into the house. But I also know there was remorse, kindness even, in his touch when he washed my back, carefully wiping away the mud, cleaning the cuts with peroxide. He kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And I kept crying, "It hurts, it hurts." Maybe I would have forgiven him. He looked so sorry, standing there with that bloody washcloth in his hand, and his touch on my back was so soft it felt like love. But when I turned around and gingerly pulled my shirt down, he said, "Don't tell Dad. Just because it feels like love doesn't mean it is." I did tell Dad, and when my brother got the belt that night, I plugged my ears and didn't cry. My dad couldn't do anything about the neighbor boy, but the boy didn't know that. He stayed away from our house for a month after that. Like I said, we weren't much, and we knew it. But we weren't rental kids either, so we had something to stand on. Looking back at all this, at the rundown state of all our houses and the little secrets we hid behind closed doors, it is downright shocking we had the gall to affect snobbishness. But affect it we did, and that's the world Robin dropped into when her mom and dad dropped their double wide in the corner of what was supposed to be our baseball field. No one in the neighborhood was going to ever forgive the Kellers for messing up a perfectly good baseball field. And until that summer, I didn't know I could do anything different than what the neighborhood did. For 3 whole weeks after they moved in, Mary, Lucy, and I made a point of not playing with Robin. We played right in front of her house, just so she would know we weren't playing with her. We would take sticks out of her yard to draw hopscotch squares in the dirt road in front of her house. When supper time came, we threw our stones into her yard like so much trash. I can still see her small white face peering out the window at us, watching while we pretended she didn't exist. It would be easy to paint Robin as some kind of savior in this scene, some kind of second, better part of me, but that wouldn't be completely honest. She was just a girl my age that lived near me for a while. In the way of proximity, we became friends. In the way of young girls, we became best friends. I'm not sure where Mary and Lucy were that day I first talked to Robin. I just remember that I was alone, and I was doing what I always did when no one was around. I was pretending to be a wild horse. After all these years, I can still remember how real my imagination made this game. Words just aren't enough to explain it, and saying it now makes me laugh, but back then it was serious business. Our yard, the biggest in the neighborhood and with the most trees, was big enough to hold a tropical island, a mountain range, and high plains so wide you couldn't walk from one side to the other in a day's time. I didn't need Mary or Lucy. I didn't need anybody. I was a wild stallion, the fastest, strongest, wildest, most beautiful wild stallion that ever walked the earth. As a little girl, I was timid and clumsy, but when I became a horse, I became everything I knew about power and freedom. Sometimes, even now, when the late afternoon light is slanting just so across green space or through trees, I can remember just exactly what it felt like to take on that magic. I can close my eyes, breathe deeply, and feel velvety nostrils flare, picking up the scent of danger, freedom. That day, alone in my yard, in the small part between the house on the corner and the alley, I was running from wolves when suddenly I saw Robin across the street. She was leaping across fallen trees and dodging branches. She stopped, and at first I thought she was looking at me, but then I realized she didn't see anything that was around her. She tossed her hair back and lifted her nose to the wind. I knew that movement like I knew the beating of my own heart. She was pretending to be a horse. I swear my ears pricked up, flickered in an attempt to hear her. Somehow or another, I found myself across the street in her yard, and then we were in mine. We didn't talk that first day. Instead, we just raced and jumped and dodged, not needing to explain what we were running from or jumping over or dodging around. Like horses, we just knew. Isn't that what friendship is supposed to be? That's what I thought, and more importantly, I believed it could stay that way. When Robin's anxiously awaited visit came, I was standing on the porch waiting. As soon as I saw them pull up, I raced out to the car to meet her. My mom frowned at my obviously childish behavior when I jumped off the porch, but I went right ahead and galloped toward the car. For her part, the alleged Robin came out of the car like a bronco out of a chute. We met at the end of the sidewalk and grabbed each other in a bear hug. Then we remembered how dumb we thought hugging was, so we backed up and laughed. Robin's mom got out of the car then and walked up the walk to the house. My mom met her halfway. I knew she didn't want her to come in because it was wash day, and she didn't like anyone to come in on wash day. I was also aware that Mom had never, not once, invited Mrs. Keller into our house in the 2 years they lived across the street. As far as I knew, Mom had never been in the Keller's house either. Mrs. Keller stood there in front of my mom, lighting up a cigarette and blowing smoke out of the corner of her mouth. I knew Mom was not going to invite her in then. A smoking father was one thing, but a smoking mother? They stood together in that weird, stiff way that grown-ups do when they don't like each other but don't want to admit it. Finally, Mrs. Keller said, "Well, I'll come back for Robin around 4 o'clock. She looked at us and said it again, as if we couldn't hear or understand the language she used when she talked to Mom. "I'll come back for you around 4, okay?" "Okay," Robin answered. And then she grabbed my hand and started to run. We were off like startled colts, and suddenly it was as if she had never left. Our play that day was as much like it had been the day we met as any 2 days could be. We raced and jumped and raced some more. I thought I was in heaven. No one else knew quite how to do this with such abandon as Robin did. The fabric of our imagination wore thin only once, when I asked her if she'd remembered to bring the picture of the 2 horses that lived across the street from her house. She said, "There were no horses across the street from her house." God, I live in a city. It's not like this at all. Then she shook her head like a horse shaking off a fly and took off running again. There have been moments in my life where everything becomes suddenly clear to me, where one piece of information settles into place and completes the whole picture. This was not one of those times. In fact, it made no sense to me at all, so I chose to ignore it. Even later, when I went back over everything Robin said to me, looking for clues of what eventually occurred, I still couldn't make sense of this. When she left me, and that may be all I'm ever going to know. The world Robin left behind was no city. At night, through our open windows, we could hear crickets and frogs and freight trains that sounded their whistles but didn't slow down when they passed through on the south edge of town. Car traffic on Main Street, 2 blocks away, settled down to almost nothing by about 10 most evenings, though it picked up a little on Friday and Saturday nights when the bars closed. Trucks were the constant. Day or night, you could always hear an 18-wheeler gearing up somewhere. My dad drove a truck, and so did about half the fathers and older brothers of everybody I knew. The sound of that rising, shifting whine can still get to me, especially at night. I hear it and think somebody's leaving home. Somewhere, there's a little girl at a window watching taillights. Every time before my dad left, I would beg him to bring home a horse for me. He hauled cattle, so he had all the right equipment, and went right up into the heart of cowboy country almost every week. So how hard could it be to put just one horse in with those cows and bring it home? I explained how easy it would be for him to get the horse here, and once it was here, I could keep the horse in the playhouse out back. I would take care of it, I told him. Honest, I would. This routine went on for years, me begging, him ignoring. It got to be such a habit, I forgot to stop when I realized I didn't want a horse anymore. I came to that realization right before Christmas, the year after Robin's first visit. I was writing a letter to her the moment it hit me. I remember writing, "Tonight I'm going to tell my dad he has to bring me a horse, or I will die. I will. I know I'll die if I don't get a horse soon." As I reread what I had written, I realized it wasn't true. I wouldn't die if I didn't get a horse. I wouldn't even be all that upset. Something about it scared me. I mean, who was I if I wasn't the lover of horses? I knew I was too tall to be racing around the yard, kicking up my heels and pawing at the air with my forehooves, but I still loved horses, didn't I? I was writing this letter to Robin when my dad came home. As he sat at one end of the table, pulling off his work boots, I sat at the other, writing my heart's desire as if by rote. I kept rereading those words. I'll die if I don't get a horse soon. And I couldn't even remember what it felt like to believe it. I felt older than I'd ever felt before. My dad sat across from me eating fried potatoes and chopped steak, oblivious to the change taking place across the table from him. The rest of the family had eaten hours ago, before Dad came home, so it was just him and I at the table. Mom was moving around the kitchen, doing something that didn't interest me. Between bites, he told us about his week. As was often the case, he would be home only long enough to eat, shower, and refill his suitcase. This was the time I always made my plea. I let him leave the table, and I put my letter in an envelope, licked it closed, and sat looking at it for a long time. He was pulling on his coveralls before I said anything. He had the look of somebody already gone, and I just wanted to say something to him to make this new feeling in me go away. I don't remember exactly what I said, because it all came out in a rush, but my mom heard the last part of it, and the look on her face stopped me dead in my tracks. "Don't ever say anything like that ever again," she said. Dad didn't seem to hear either of us. He just kept leaving. "I didn't mean I didn't want him to ever come home again," I whined. "I just want a horse really, really bad." "You, go and think about what you just said." She turned her back on me and walked with Dad to the door. Goodbyes were the only time I ever saw them kiss. This time, she held onto his arm a little longer than usual. But other than that, I figured it was just another night watching taillights. When he didn't come home the night he was supposed to, I knew it was my fault. I could hear my last words to him in my head, a refrain running over and under the memory of everything I'd ever thought or done in my entire life. "If you don't bring me a horse, don't come home at all." And he didn't come home. My mom was gone when I got up for school that day, so I took care of myself. I poured a bowl of cereal, but I didn't eat it. My little sister and I walked to school together. She didn't know anything was wrong, and I didn't know what was wrong, so we walked in silence. When you learn something like this from a stranger, you remember odd things about the moment. Bob Johnson wasn't really a stranger, but until that day, he had never spoken to me or me to him. That morning, I wasn't all the way to the classroom door before he was in front of me. He was wearing a green plaid, button-down shirt, and the top button was loose. Threads stuck out like little antennae. "Hey," he said, up close to my face. I could smell the peanut butter on his breath. "I hear your old man killed somebody." "What?" I said. "Yeah, it came over the police scanner this morning. My dad always turns it on first thing in the morning. Your dad killed somebody with his truck." He looked almost puffed up with this information. Deader than a doornail. Fear feels icy when it first comes, but then it turns to fire, and I could feel it creeping up my neck and onto my face. I can remember lifting first one foot and then the other, as if walking was a newly learned skill. I walked to my desk and put my books down. A yellow No. 2 pencil with my teeth marks on it rolled out of the pencil slot and onto the floor. When I bent down to pick it up, I felt my breath leave me, and I couldn't remember how to get it back. I just kept going, slowly, until my whole body was on the floor beside the pencil. I didn't black out. I just forgot how to move. They let me go home after that. They let me walk by myself, the way they did in small towns in those days. And I found my way by staring straight ahead and letting my feet walk the familiar path. When I was about a block away from home, I saw a glint of red in front of our house. I felt again the icy tingle of it up the back of my neck, but this time it stayed icy until I was close enough to see my dad's truck parked in front of the house. It looked naked somehow, without the trailer behind it, but it was there. When I got home, my dad was sitting at the table, eating sausage and eggs, and talking to my mom. I could hear the low growl of his voice as I stepped onto the porch, and somehow I knew, when I stepped through the door, his voice would stop. Like the war stories he never told, whatever had happened to him that night would join the silence of what looked like adulthood to me. I stood outside the kitchen door, my back pressed up against the cool stucco, and listened to him tell my mom what it felt like to be the instrument of what he called another man's suicide. He came up behind me and drove under the trailer. I never even saw him. I heard him tell this whole story 3 times. Each time he said, "I never even saw him," as if he couldn't quite believe his sense of sight had failed him so completely. When I opened the screen door and walked in, they both looked at me with stricken faces. Where did I come from, they seemed to say. How did I get here? I didn't remember how to talk yet, and even if I did, I wouldn't have known what to say. I felt closer to them than I ever had, but they didn't know that. So I just went into my bedroom and cried. For what? I didn't know. The second time Robin came back for a visit, I didn't need my mom to warn me that Robin might be a little more mature than I was. 2 years had passed since that first visit, and I had changed some. I had started my period, had my first crush on a boy, and learned to live without horses. All that had happened to Robin, too, but she was way beyond me. Robin, who had written only 5 letters in those 2 years, wasn't coming back alone. She was bringing a husband. I never did learn the whole story, and trying to fit all the mismatched pieces of our letters and conversations didn't help. She didn't have to get married, I know, because I had tactlessly blurted out the question when she called and arranged a time for a visit and gave me the big news. Married? We were only 15. I hadn't even gone out on a date yet, and she was married. What could I do with that kind of information? My mother wasn't much help. She remained as silent about this mystery as she did about her dislike for Robin's mother. She didn't seem all that surprised, though. Her lips got tight when I told her, and she didn't say anything at first. But when I kept talking about it, about how I just couldn't believe it, she said that the Keller family was different. That's as far as she would go. My new best friend, Barb, was the one who first got me thinking about the possibility of this being a love match. Maybe she just loves him so much she can't live without him, she said when we were walking to school one morning. Barb had never known Robin, so her view of her could be anything she wanted it to be. I, on the other hand, had to work with my image of Robin as a wild horse in a young girl's body. Horses don't fall in love. They love their freedom, they love the wind, they love open spaces and green grass. But to fall in love, get married, be a wife, who would have thought such a thing? Not me, I can assure you. But I didn't have anything else to explain it. So along with Barb, I began to see Robin as some kind of romantic heroine. She was the first of my friends to fall under that deep, mysterious spell of love, and as such, she became a romantic mystery herself. In the days before her visit, I began to imagine her husband with the same kind of detailed, exacting daydreams I had formerly limited to dreams of horses. Though any psychologist worth her salt would point out here that the leap from fantasizing about wild horses to imagining a friend's husband is a small and deeply related leap, I didn't see it that way. I didn't try to imagine their sex life together. In fact, I spent most of the time thinking about them riding horses together, usually across some misty moor or along a deserted beach. That he would love horses was never in question for me. Of course he would. Robin hadn't changed that much. The day she came was as cloudy and dreary as the first visit had been sunny and warm. This time, Robin and her husband came for me. I wasn't waiting on the porch, and when they pulled up, Robin's husband honked the horn. They both stayed in the car and waited until I came out. I got in the back seat. Robin talked about almost everything under the sun from the minute I got in the car until the minute we got to the ranch where the Keller family was staying. I say she talked about almost everything. She didn't talk about her husband, she didn't talk to her husband, and she didn't tell me his name. When we got to the ranch, she got out of the car and said to me, "Come on, I want you to see the horse we get to ride today." Her husband walked over to the fence, lit up a cigarette, and watched us walk away. It wasn't until we were on the horse, riding double, that I got up the courage to ask his name. "Vincent," she said, "but I call him Vinny." She touched her heels to the horse's flank and started off at a trot. Man, this nag sure has a rough ride. It was rough enough to keep me from asking any more questions, and I guess that was the point. When we got back to the corral, Vinny was still waiting by the fence. "My turn," he said, and he took the reins before we answered him. He jumped up onto the saddle without using the stirrup, sort of a Roy Rogers move that would have been cool when we were 12. I didn't look at Robin, though, so I don't know what she thought of it. I still thought he must be good with horses, or Robin wouldn't have married him. I kept thinking that, even when I saw him grab a switch from a willow tree at the edge of the corral. Surely he wouldn't use that on a horse, I thought. But he did. He started whipping the horse right in front of us, and he was still whipping it when they disappeared from sight over the hill. I looked at Robin, but she was studying something on her finger and didn't meet my eyes. Finally, she said, "I'll show you where we're sleeping this week. It's kind of a cool little cabin." We walked in silence toward a small building that must have at one time been a milk house. An old-fashioned separator still stood outside the door. Robin opened the door and pointed inside. I started to walk in, but when I saw that all that was inside the building was a mattress on the floor covered with twisted-up sheets and blankets, I stopped. "Cool," I said, and backed away from the door. I don't know how many years it would take me to figure out why that scene made me feel uncomfortable. I was, as my mom recognized long ago, immature for my age. Truth be told, I think I still am. I seem to be walking through life one or two steps behind my peers. I have this feeling hanging over me that everyone knows something I don't, has discovered the next stage before I'm completely finished with the one we're in. That's what it was about playing horses that I loved so much, that all my senses were so acute, nothing got past me. I could see, hear, smell the future, and I knew what to do about it. When I raised my nose to the wind and whinnied, the whole herd would follow me, and I always knew where to go. Oh, the thrill of knowing. I honestly don't remember how long it was before Vinny came back, and I don't remember what Robin and I did or what we talked about while we waited. All I really remember about the rest of the day was the sight of Vinny racing toward us, still whipping that horse. He must have been only a few yards in front of us when he jerked up on the reins and stopped that poor horse. Mud shot up from its hooves and bloody foam flew from its mouth. Vinny leaped off the horse before it came to a complete stop. Robin and I just stood there. We didn't get out of the way or move to protect one another. Our human senses, so poor at preparing us for action. We weren't playing horses anymore. I never saw Robin again after that day. The awkwardness in the car when she took me home hardened into a silence neither of us was able to break. Somehow or another I learned that the Keller family had moved again, that Robin had moved with them, without Vinny, but I never learned her new address. The summer we turned 18, the summer before my last year of high school and the last year I lived in that little town, the Kellers came back for a visit. Robin didn't come that time. I learned of their visit when her mother came in to buy cigarettes in the store where I worked. I had already rung up her purchase and was handing back her change before we recognized each other. "You're the girl that loved horses," she said. I smiled my best customer service smile and asked her about Robin. She nodded and started walking away before she answered. "Oh, Robin, she and her husband Dan moved up to Phoenix," she said over her shoulder. "They got jobs up there. I'll tell her I ran into you." The door swished shut behind her. I watched her open a pack of cigarettes before getting into her car. The clear cellophanes flittered across the parking lot, almost invisible. I pictured Vinny, how he had stopped that horse in front of us that day, the bit pulled tight against the softness of its mouth. When I played horses, I knew how to take that bit in my teeth. And though I have never seen a real horse do it, I still believed it was possible. Robin's remarried, I thought. Man, I didn't see that coming again. It wasn't until Mrs. Keller's car pulled out of the parking lot that I remembered what she had said to me about me and horses. I watched her receding taillights until they were out of sight and thought about the time when that was true, when I was the girl who loved horses. No, I finally said to myself, I didn't just love horses. The slowness of my response bringing back the ache of something long since lost. I didn't just love them. Thank you.